Bonn, West Germany. April 1985. Margarete Höke sat at her desk in the West German Chancellor's office, the soft hum of the typewriter filling the silence of the late afternoon. At 52, she had served the Federal Republic for nearly 3 decades, handling classified documents with the same meticulous care she brought to everything in her ordered life. Her fingers moved across the keys, transcribing a NATO intelligence assessment marked streng geheim, top secret. She paused, glancing at the framed photograph on her desk. Her boyfriend smiled back at her, a kind-looking man 10 years her junior, who had swept into her quiet existence 2 years earlier with flowers, attention, and the sort of romantic devotion she had long since stopped expecting from life. He was traveling again for business, he'd said. She missed him already. What Margarete didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the man in the photograph didn't exist. Not really. His name wasn't the one he'd given her. His business trips were debriefing sessions in East Berlin, and every word she'd whispered to him across candlelit dinners, every document she'd casually mentioned, every detail of her office layout had been methodically filed in a Stasi dossier bearing her name. She was one of hundreds. By the time West German counterintelligence finally identified her in 1985, Margarete Höke had been feeding NATO secrets to East Germany for years. Her crime. Falling in love with a man trained from the beginning to break her heart and her country's security. The Stasi called them Romeo Spies. It would become one of the most devastatingly effective espionage operations of the entire Cold War. In the harsh calculus of Cold War espionage, the Stasi's Romeo operation appeared almost theatrical when it began. A con man's game played against the deadly serious backdrop of nuclear brinkmanship. Traditional intelligence thinking favored technical operations. Dead drops, encrypted transmissions, sophisticated surveillance equipment. The idea of systematically deploying attractive young men to seduce lonely secretaries seemed almost frivolous, a remnant of Cold War pulp fiction rather than serious tradecraft. The West German security establishment, the Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz, BFV, initially dismissed early warnings about the tactic. "We were looking for the classic spy," recalled BFV officer Klaus Curon years later. Someone with ideological motivation, someone who might be blackmailed, someone who needed money. We weren't looking for women who simply fell in love with the wrong man. That blind spot was precisely what the Stasi counted on. Markus Wolf, the legendary head of East Germany's Foreign Intelligence Service, the Hauptverwaltung Aufklärung, HVA, understood something fundamental about human nature that his Western counterparts had overlooked. "We didn't need to turn committed enemies into traitors," Wolf later explained in his memoirs. "We just needed to find people who were lonely and give them what they were missing." The strategic logic was ruthlessly simple. West Germany's post-war bureaucracy employed thousands of women in secretarial positions. Women who had access to classified documents but limited professional advancement. Who lived quiet lives in a rapidly modernizing society that often left them behind. Many were unmarried, divorced, or widowed. They were competent, trustworthy, and almost invisible to their employers. "The secretaries knew everything," Wolf observed. "They typed the documents, filed the reports, scheduled the meetings. They were present for conversations that were later classified. And nobody thought they mattered." Soviet intelligence advisors initially questioned whether the operation could produce meaningful results. KGB liaison officers pushed for more traditional recruitment methods: ideological cultivation, financial inducement, blackmail. But Wolf had studied the West German bureaucracy for years. He knew that in Bonn's ministerial offices, in NATO headquarters in Brussels, in the offices of defense contractors and research institutes, there were women who held no particular political beliefs. but who possessed something far more valuable: access. The Stasi's confidence was built on early successes. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, sporadic cases had demonstrated the concept's viability. A pretty boy agent would accidentally meet a secretary, cultivate a relationship, and gradually exploit her access. The results were promising enough to attempt systematization. By the mid-1960s, Wolf had convinced his superiors and his skeptical Soviet advisors that the Romeo approach deserved significant resources. "Give me young men who can play a role," he told his training staff, "and I'll get you into the heart of the West German government." Western intelligence agencies, meanwhile, remained focused on what they considered serious threats. The CIA was hunting high-level political moles. NATO security concentrated on protecting military secrets from traditional espionage. The very banality of the Romeo operation, lonely men meeting lonely women, made it nearly invisible to detection. "We thought we understood how the Stasi operated," admitted Herbert Hellenbroich, who would later head the BFV. "We were wrong. They understood us better than we understood ourselves." That understanding would give East Germany an intelligence advantage that lasted decades, penetrating some of the most sensitive institutions in the Western Alliance. The Romeos were coming, and West Germany had no idea what was about to hit them. The genesis of the Stasi's Romeo operation emerged from the unique circumstances of Cold War Germany. A nation split down the middle, families divided, and two antagonistic states locked in intimate proximity. Unlike the vast distances separating Moscow and Washington, East and West Germany shared a language, a culture, and living memory of national unity. This created both necessity and opportunity for East German intelligence. Markus Wolf, who took control of the HVA in 1958 at just 35 years old, was the perfect architect for this distinctly German form of espionage. Born in Germany but raised in Soviet exile, educated in Moscow but culturally German, Wolf possessed an almost anthropological understanding of both societies. Strikingly handsome with a sharp mind and sophisticated tastes, he personally embodied the type of agent he would later deploy against the West. The institutional framework was already in place. The Ministry for State Security, the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, universally known as the Stasi, had been established in 1950 under Soviet guidance. By the late 1950s, it employed over 20,000 full-time officers and at least 100,000 informants in a country of just 17 million people. But Wolf's HVA, the Foreign Intelligence Directorate, operated differently from the Stasi's domestic apparatus. His agents wouldn't intimidate, they would seduce. The strategic imperative was clear. West Germany, established in 1949, had quickly become the linchpin of NATO's defense against Soviet expansion. By the early 1960s, the Federal Republic was rearming under American sponsorship, hosting NATO forces, and developing into an economic powerhouse that dwarfed the GDR's command economy. For the Stasi, penetrating West German institutions wasn't just an intelligence priority, it was an existential necessity. Wolf began recruiting his first generation of Romeo agents in the late 1950s. The selection criteria were exacting. Men in their 20s or early 30s, attractive but not memorably handsome, educated enough to be interesting but not so accomplished as to seem implausible, and above all, patient. "We weren't looking for James Bond," recalled Werner Stiller, a Stasi officer who later defected. "We needed men who could sustain a double life for years, who could fake genuine affection, who could lie every single day without breaking character." The training was comprehensive. Romeo candidates spent months at Stasi facilities in East Berlin and the surrounding countryside, studying West German society in exhaustive detail. They learned about Western consumer brands, pop culture, political parties, sports teams, the mundane details that would make their cover stories believable. They studied Western body language, speech patterns, even Western attitudes toward relationships and sexuality. "We created a curriculum in deception," Wolf later acknowledged. They learned how to write love letters, how to remember anniversaries, how to feign interest in their targets' hobbies. They studied psychology, not academic theory, but practical techniques for building emotional dependency. The agents received detailed briefings on their specific targets before deployment. The Stasi maintained extensive files on West German civil servants, compiled from public records, informant reports, and surveillance. A typical target profile might note that a secretary was divorced, attended Protestant church services, enjoyed classical music, and lived alone with a cat. The Romeo agent's legend, his cover story, would be crafted to complement these details perfectly. Hans-Joachim Tiege, who ran counterintelligence operations before his own defection to the East in 1985, later described the Stasi's targeting methodology. They looked for vulnerability, but not the obvious kind. Not women who were desperate or unstable. They wanted competent, reliable people who happened to be lonely. Women who would never suspect they were being targeted because they didn't think they were interesting enough to target. The operational deployment followed a careful pattern. Romeo agents typically entered West Germany through legal channels, as refugees claiming to flee the East, as visiting students, or with false West German papers. They would establish themselves in cities near government offices. Bonn, the capital, was prime territory, but also Cologne, Frankfurt, Munich, and West Berlin. The initial approach appeared entirely coincidental. A Romeo might accidentally sit next to a target at a concert she regularly attended. He might strike up a conversation at her usual cafe. He might be introduced through carefully cultivated mutual acquaintances, sometimes unwitting, sometimes Stasi assets themselves. The contact had to seem natural, explained Günther Guillaume's case officer in a later debriefing. Guillaume, though not strictly a Romeo agent, had used similar methods before his spectacular exposure as a mole in Chancellor Willy Brandt's office in 1974. If the woman ever suspected she was being courted deliberately, the operation would fail. The art was making her think she had discovered him, not the other way around. The courtship phase could last months or even years before any intelligence exploitation began. Romeos were instructed to be patient, to build genuine seeming relationships. They attended family gatherings, remembered birthdays, provided emotional support during difficult times. Many agents maintained their cover relationships for 5, 10, even 15 years. Only after a deep emotional bond was established would the intelligence requests begin. And even then, they started small. A Romeo might casually ask about office politics, gradually escalating to requests to see specific documents. The women, by this point emotionally invested, typically complied. Many convinced themselves they weren't really committing treason. They were just helping the man they loved understand West German policy, or they rationalized that the information wasn't really that sensitive. By the mid-1960s, Wolf had refined the operation into a systematic program. The Stasi established dedicated training facilities, developed psychological profiles of ideal targets, and created bureaucratic procedures for managing dozens of simultaneous Romeo operations. The HVA's Department 9 became the institutional home for these operations, though individual Romeos were run by case officers throughout the HVA's structure. The investment was substantial: years of training, expensive cover maintenance, risk of exposure. But the returns exceeded expectations. Unlike technical operations that might capture a single document or photograph a few meetings, a well-placed Romeo provided continuous access to institutional knowledge, advance warning of policy changes, and insights into personalities and power structures that no amount of signals intelligence could reveal. We weren't just stealing secrets, Wolf reflected years later, with what might have been pride or remorse. We were building human surveillance systems inside the West German government. Living, breathing sources who updated themselves, who could answer questions, who could contextualize what they gave us. As the 1970s began, the Stasi's Romeo network was expanding. They had successfully penetrated multiple West German ministries, NATO facilities, and defense contractors. The operation's security was excellent. Few cases had been exposed, and those that were seemed like isolated incidents rather than symptoms of a systemic program. Western counterintelligence remained largely unaware. The very nature of the operation, men courting women, romance leading to pillow talk, seemed almost quaint compared to the high-tech espionage of the space age. While American and Soviet intelligence agencies competed to build better satellites and more sophisticated listening devices, the Stasi was winning the old-fashioned way, by understanding that human loneliness was the ultimate security vulnerability. December 1973, Bonn. The champagne glasses clinked in celebration, but Günther Guillaume was calculating. As he stood in Chancellor Willy Brandt's private office, having just been promoted to a sensitive position handling the Chancellor's correspondence, Guillaume understood that he had achieved something unprecedented. He wasn't a Romeo in the technical sense. His relationship with his wife Crystal was genuine, if complicated by the fact that both were Stasi agents. But his success demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of long-term human penetration operations. I had waited 18 years for this moment, Guillaume later wrote from prison. 18 years of being the reliable assistant, the competent bureaucrat, the trustworthy friend. And now I had access to everything. What Guillaume didn't know that December evening was that West German counterintelligence had already begun to suspect him. The investigation would lead to his arrest in April 1974, triggering the resignation of Chancellor Brandt and sending shockwaves through the Western Alliance. But more importantly for the Romeo program, Guillaume's exposure forced Western security services to ask an uncomfortable question. If a spy could penetrate the Chancellor's inner circle, what else had they missed? The answer was terrifying. Throughout 1974 and 1975, as West German counterintelligence reassessed their assumptions, a clearer picture began to emerge. The Stasi wasn't running isolated agents. They were running a systematic program, and many of their most successful penetrations weren't ideologically motivated traitors or financially desperate targets. They were women in love. In Munich, investigators reviewing old surveillance files noticed a pattern. Several secretaries in defense contractor offices had relationships with men whose backgrounds didn't quite check out. The men had appeared in the women's lives seemingly by chance. A meeting at a concert, an introduction at a social club, a conversation in a bookshop. In each case, the relationship had developed slowly, naturally. And in each case, the woman had access to classified information. We started pulling threads, recalled Heribert Hellenbroich, then a senior BFV officer. Each thread led to another. We realized we weren't looking at individual cases. We were looking at an operation with industrial scale and precision. The breakthrough case came in March 1975 with the arrest of Gabriele Gast. A trained academic working in the BFV's own analysis division, Gast had been recruited not through romance, but through a combination of intellectual cultivation and later, a relationship with her Stasi handler. Her interrogation revealed the scope and sophistication of HVA operations targeting West German institutions. They knew everything about us, Gast told investigators. They knew our work schedules, our social lives, our insecurities. They knew which of us were lonely, which were ambitious, which were unhappy. and they had people trained specifically to exploit those vulnerabilities. But even as West German counterintelligence began to understand the Romeo methodology, the Stasi was reaching the peak of its effectiveness. Throughout the mid to late 1970s, as détente created a false sense of East-West cooperation, Romeo agents were providing an intelligence windfall that exceeded Markus Wolf's most optimistic projections. In Bonn, Margarete Höke continued typing classified NATO documents while maintaining her relationship with Franz Becker, actually HVA officer Karl Rehbaum. She had no idea that every piece of information she casually shared was being transmitted to East Berlin, analyzed, and forwarded to Moscow. In Brussels, NATO Secretary Heidrun Hofer was providing her boyfriend with details of alliance military planning. The boyfriend, HVA officer Klaus Dietrich, had convinced her that he was a West German businessman opposed to NATO's nuclear posture. Hofer believed she was helping the peace movement. In reality, she was compromising NATO's operational security. At West Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, BND headquarters in Pullach, Secretary Ursel Lorenzen was in a relationship with Heinz Felfe, an alias for HVA officer Erwin Meisner. Through Lorenzen, the Stasi gained insights into West German intelligence operations, allowing them to protect their own networks and compromise Western operations. The intelligence haul was staggering. Between 1975 and 1979, by later estimates, Romeo operations and associated HVA penetrations provided East Germany with NATO contingency plans for Central European conflict scenarios, West German political analysis of Soviet intentions and capabilities, details of Western intelligence operations targeting the Eastern Bloc, internal West German government communications about détente negotiations, information about defense procurement and weapons development, assessments of political vulnerabilities within the Western Alliance. We were reading their mail, a senior HVA officer later boasted after reunification. Not metaphorically, literally. We knew what the West German government was thinking before most West German politicians did. The psychological impact was equally significant. By 1977, paranoia was spreading through Bonn's bureaucracy. Who could be trusted? Which relationships were genuine? The very intimacy of the Romeo methodology meant that suspicion poisoned personal relationships even when no espionage was involved. NATO conducted a comprehensive security review in 1978, quietly tightening access controls and implementing new vetting procedures. But the review faced a fundamental problem. The Stasi wasn't exploiting security weaknesses in the traditional sense. They were exploiting human psychology. You couldn't build a fence against loneliness. The turning point's true significance emerged in the early 1980s, as Cold War tensions escalated dramatically under the Reagan administration. NATO's decision to deploy Pershing II missiles and cruise missiles in Western Europe sparked massive protests and intense diplomatic maneuvering. Throughout this crucial period, the Stasi's Romeo network provided Moscow and East Berlin with extraordinary insights into Western planning. In December 1981, Polish leader Wojciech Jaruzelski declared martial law to crush the Solidarity movement. Western governments debated their response, aware that their options were limited, but determined to support democratic aspirations. Stasi sources in Bonn provided detailed reports on internal West German debates about sanctions, diplomatic measures, and contingency planning. The East knew our bottom line before we did, observed Richard von Weizsäcker, then governing mayor of West Berlin and later German president. They could see our internal disagreements, our political constraints, our fears about triggering a larger crisis. It gave them an enormous advantage in calibrating their own responses. The peak of the Romeo operation's effectiveness coincided, ironically, with the beginning of its unraveling. In 1985, a high-level Stasi officer, Hans-Joachim Thiege, defected to East Germany. But not before West German counterintelligence had begun systematically hunting Romeo agents. The exposure of Margarete Höke in April 1985 was particularly dramatic. When BFV officers arrested her, she initially refused to believe that her boyfriend was a Stasi agent. "You're lying," she told investigators. "Franz loves me. He's asked me to marry him." The BFV officers had to show her surveillance photographs of Franz Becker entering Stasi facilities in East Berlin, meeting with known HVA officers and filing reports that quoted her verbatim. Even then, she struggled to accept the reality. "I think the worst part wasn't that she'd betrayed her country," one investigator later reflected. "It was watching her realize that the most meaningful relationship of her life had been a lie from the very first moment. That broke her more than any prison sentence could." By late 1985, the scope of the Romeo operation was becoming clear to Western intelligence. A BFV report classified at the time, but later declassified, estimated that the Stasi had successfully run, at minimum, several dozen, possibly hundreds, of long-term human sources recruited through romantic or sexual relationships. The strategic damage was immense. NATO had to assume that virtually every classified document that had passed through West German government channels in the previous 20 years had potentially been compromised. Contingency plans were rewritten. Intelligence sharing protocols were revised. Trust between allies, already strained by other espionage scandals, eroded further. The Romeos didn't just steal secrets, noted intelligence historian Christopher Andrew years later. They undermined confidence in the entire security system. How do you protect against an adversary who weaponizes human emotion? As the Cold War entered its final phase, the Romeo operation stood as both a triumph and a tragedy, a testament to the Stasi's understanding of human vulnerability, and a monument to the human cost of the intelligence war. The secretaries who had fallen in love with lies faced prison terms. The agents who had built false lives faced exposure. And the governments that had failed to protect their own people faced uncomfortable questions about the price of security. The champagne that Günther Guillaume had sipped in Willy Brandt's office had long since gone flat. But the consequences of what he and the Romeo agents who followed similar methods had accomplished would echo for decades. Western response and defensive measures. The exposure of the Romeo network forced a painful evolution in Western security thinking. Traditional counterintelligence had focused on detecting ideological motivation, financial desperation, or blackmail vulnerability. The Stasi had weaponized something far more difficult to defend against: the basic human need for connection. West Germany's initial response was bureaucratic and somewhat ham-fisted. In 1976, the BFV issued new security guidelines that included warnings about suspicious romantic approaches targeting government employees. The guidelines were remarkably tone-deaf, essentially instructing civil servants, particularly women, to be suspicious of anyone who showed romantic interest in them. The advice was practically useless, recalled Ursula Richter, who worked in the foreign ministry during this period. They were telling us to suspect every date, every social introduction, every friendly conversation. It was impossible to actually live that way. Some women just became isolated, others ignored the warnings entirely. More substantive changes came in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The West German government implemented enhanced background checks for personnel with access to classified information, though these focused primarily on financial records and political associations, rather than psychological vulnerability. Periodic revetting became standard, and employees were required to report significant changes in their personal relationships. NATO established new compartmentalization protocols, limiting the number of people with access to sensitive information and implementing stricter document handling procedures. "We couldn't prevent secretaries from falling in love," explained a NATO security officer, "but we could reduce what any single person could compromise." The CIA, watching the Romeo cases unfold, quietly reviewed its own security procedures. Agency psychologists developed new screening methods, attempting to identify susceptibility to emotional manipulation. The results were mixed. Human psychology proved resistant to bureaucratic categorization. West German counterintelligence became more aggressive in surveillance of foreign nationals and refugees from East Germany. Travel patterns were monitored more closely. Background stories were verified more thoroughly. But the Stasi adapted faster than Western security could keep pace. By the early 1980s, the BFV had established a dedicated unit focusing specifically on personal relationship-based recruitment operations. The unit developed profiles of likely targets and attempted proactive intervention, essentially warning individuals that they might be targeted. This approach had limited success and raised uncomfortable questions about state intrusion into private lives, Stasi refinement, and tactical adjustments. Far from being deterred by Western awareness, the HVA refined its Romeo operations with characteristic German thoroughness. Markus Wolf recognized that the initial wave of exposures in the mid-1970s required tactical adjustments without abandoning the fundamental approach. The Stasi's first adaptation was in agent selection and training. New Romeo recruits received enhanced instruction in maintaining cover under suspicion. They learned techniques for explaining inconsistencies in their backgrounds, methods for detecting surveillance, and protocols for breaking contact if exposure seemed imminent. "We taught them to be more careful, not less ambitious," explained a former HVA training officer after reunification. "The Western response showed us we were effective. We just needed to be more sophisticated." The HVA also diversified its approach. While continuing to target secretaries with access to classified information, they expanded operations to include journalists, political activists, and academics who could provide different types of valuable intelligence. The basic Romeo methodology, emotional cultivation leading to exploitation, remained the same, but the target profile broadened. Operational security was tightened dramatically. Contact between Romeo agents and their handlers became less frequent and more carefully orchestrated. The Stasi invested in more sophisticated communications methods, including encrypted messages concealed in seemingly innocent letters and brief personal meetings in carefully surveilled locations where Western counterintelligence was less likely to operate effectively. The Stasi also became more patient. Operations that might previously have moved from initial contact to intelligence exploitation in 12 or 18 months now took 2, 3, even 5 years to develop. We learned that the longer the relationship seemed genuine, the less likely it was to be detected, noted a declassified HVA training document from 1982. One particularly cynical adaptation involved what the Stasi called insurance relationships. Romeo agents were instructed to develop friendships and social connections beyond their primary target, creating a network of social legitimacy. If questioned about their background, multiple people could vouch for them based on years of apparently genuine friendship. The HVA also refined its targeting methodology based on an increasingly sophisticated understanding of West German society. They paid particular attention to women in their 40s and 50s who had dedicated their careers to public service, but faced limited advancement opportunities due to prevailing gender discrimination. These women often possessed deep institutional knowledge, strong professional networks, and felt undervalued by their employers, a combination the Stasi found particularly exploitable. Proxy complications and third-party effects. The Romeo operation's success created unexpected complications for Soviet intelligence. The KGB, while initially skeptical of the approach, began attempting to replicate it, with notably less success. Soviet agents lacked the cultural fluency and language skills of their East German counterparts. Their attempts at Western romance often seemed stilted or unconvincing. The Russians tried to copy what Wolf was doing, but they didn't understand that it worked because East and West Germans were still culturally connected, observed Oleg Kalugin, a former KGB general who later defected. A Soviet agent trying to pass as a West German businessman was always going to have rough edges. The Stasi agents could be completely convincing because they were, in many ways, the same people as their targets. The Warsaw Pact's other intelligence services showed varying levels of interest in the Romeo methodology. The Czech SB and Polish SB ran limited operations targeting Western diplomats posted in Eastern Europe, but nothing approaching the systematic scale of the HVA program. More significantly, the Romeo operations affected internal Warsaw Pact dynamics. East German intelligence often possessed better information about West German politics than the KGB could obtain through its own operations. This gave the GDR leadership, particularly under Erich Honecker, a degree of independence in dealing with Moscow. The HVA's success was a source of pride for East Germany, but also concern for the Soviets, explained a Cold War intelligence historian. Moscow wanted the intelligence, but they worried about East Berlin having leverage based on information Moscow didn't independently possess. The human cost accumulates. By the mid-1980s, the psychological toll on Romeo agents themselves became apparent, even to the Stasi. Maintaining a false identity for years, feigning intimate emotions, and living a perpetual double life produced predictable stress. Some agents developed genuine feelings for their targets, complicating their operational effectiveness. Karl Rehbaum, who ran Margarete Höke for years, later admitted in interviews that maintaining the deception had become increasingly difficult. "I told myself it was necessary for the socialist cause," he said. "But I couldn't completely suppress the knowledge that I was destroying someone's life. Not because she was an enemy, she wasn't political at all, but just because she had fallen in love with a lie." The Stasi established psychological support programs for Romeo agents showing signs of stress, but these were limited and often ineffective. Some agents requested reassignment. A few defected to the West, though their knowledge of HVA operations meant they faced the possibility of assassination if they were deemed security risks. For the targets, the psychological damage was even more severe. As cases were exposed throughout the 1980s, the pattern of emotional devastation became clear. Women who had believed they were in genuine relationships discovered that years or decades of their lives had been based on carefully orchestrated deception. "It wasn't like discovering your partner was cheating," explained a psychologist who counseled several victims after exposure. "It was discovering that the person you loved never existed at all. Every conversation, every moment of seeming intimacy, every shared experience, all of it was calculated manipulation. The psychological impact was comparable to severe trauma. Some targets suffered complete psychological breakdowns. Several attempted suicide. Even those who maintained their emotional stability faced social stigma, professional ruin, and legal consequences ranging from fines to imprisonment. Final years and diminishing returns. As the Cold War entered its terminal phase in the late 1980s, the Romeo operation faced increasing challenges. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union created uncertainty about the GDR's future. Some HVA officers began questioning whether the intelligence they gathered still mattered if the ideological conflict was winding down. The practical effectiveness also declined. Western security measures, while imperfect, had become more sophisticated. The political climate of glasnost and perestroika made some forms of espionage seem outdated, And most significantly, the pool of vulnerable targets had been exploited extensively over 3 decades. By 1988, we were running out of easy targets, a former HVA officer acknowledged. The women who were most lonely, most isolated, most vulnerable, many had already been approached. The ones who remained were either more suspicious or simply less accessible. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 caught many Romeo agents in operational limbo. Some fled back to East Germany. Others attempted to maintain their cover in the chaos of reunification. A few confessed to their partners, hoping for understanding that rarely materialized. The evolution of the Romeo operation over 3 decades revealed a fundamental truth about intelligence work in the Cold War. The most effective operations weren't always the most technologically sophisticated. Sometimes the oldest methods, manipulation, seduction, deception, remained the most powerful because they exploited vulnerabilities that no security system could completely eliminate. June 1990, Berlin. The unified German government's investigation team had spent months in the Stasi headquarters at Normannenstrasse, wading through an almost incomprehensible volume of files. Room after room contained meticulously organized dossiers documenting 40 years of surveillance, intimidation, and espionage. But nothing prepared investigators for what they found in the HVA's Department 9 archives. The Romeo files contained photographs of the agents and their targets. Couples smiling at restaurants, walking hand in hand through parks, celebrating anniversaries. Beneath each photograph were clinical intelligence assessments, quantifying the relationship's productivity, rating the target's continued usefulness, and planning the eventual termination of the operation. It was like discovering a museum of broken hearts, recalled one investigator. Except each exhibit represented a security breach that had compromised Western defenses for years. The final accounting was devastating. While exact numbers remained disputed, investigators identified at least 80 confirmed Romeo operations that had successfully penetrated West German government institutions, NATO facilities, and defense-related industries. Estimates suggested the actual number might be 2 to 3 times higher, with many cases never fully documented, even in Stasi files. The intelligence damage was quantified in NATO and German intelligence assessments that remained classified for years. At minimum, Romeo operations had compromised. Over 2,000 NATO classified documents detailing military planning, force deployments, and contingency operations. West German assessments of Soviet capabilities and intentions spanning 3 decades. Details of intelligence operations that had to be terminated once compromise was discovered. Personal information about Western political leaders used to inform East German and Soviet negotiating strategies. Technical specifications of weapon systems and defense technologies. The economic impact ran into billions of Deutsche Marks in compromised research and development, not counting the cost of enhanced security measures and the intelligence operations that had to be restructured or abandoned. But the human cost defied quantification. Of the identified Romeo targets, 34 faced criminal prosecution. Sentences ranged from suspended sentences to 6 years imprisonment for the most serious cases. Many more escaped prosecution due to insufficient evidence, statute of limitations issues, or death before prosecution. Margarete Höke, the secretary whose story opened this account, received a suspended sentence in 1987 after pleading guilty to espionage charges. She testified that she had genuinely loved Franz Becker and had convinced herself that the information she provided wasn't really that important. "I was a fool," she told the court in a voice barely above a whisper. "But I was a fool who loved someone I thought was real. That's not the same as being a traitor." The court disagreed with her self-assessment, but the judge acknowledged the unique nature of her victimization during sentencing. "You were exploited by someone trained specifically to exploit you," he noted. That does not excuse your actions, but it contextualizes them. Karl Rehbaum, her handler, was never prosecuted. He remained in the reunified Germany under his true identity, living quietly and refusing most interview requests. In one of the few interviews he granted, years later, he was asked if he felt remorse. "I did my duty to my country," he replied. "But I cannot forget that my duty required destroying someone who had done nothing wrong except fall in love with a lie. If that's not a crime, it should be." Markus Wolf himself faced prosecution after reunification, though his case highlighted the complex legal and moral questions surrounding espionage in a conflict that both sides had pursued with equal vigor. Initially sentenced to 6 years for treason and bribery, his conviction was eventually overturned by Germany's constitutional court on the grounds that he had acted on behalf of a foreign government that had been recognized by West Germany. "I regret the human suffering caused by our operations," Wolf stated after his conviction was overturned. "But I do not regret defending my country using the methods available to me. The West did the same. They were simply less successful at this particular approach." The peak of the operation's effectiveness had come in the late 1970s and early 1980s, precisely when Cold War tensions were highest and when NATO's defensive posture in Central Europe was most critical. During this period, the intelligence provided by Romeo sources gave the Soviet Union and East Germany extraordinary visibility into Western military planning. Soviet military archives opened after the Cold War revealed how this intelligence was used. East German reports were incorporated into Soviet General Staff assessments of NATO capabilities. Information about alliance internal debates informed Soviet diplomatic strategies during arms control negotiations. Details about Western political disagreements helped Moscow calibrate its responses to various crises. "The Romeos gave them our playbook," observed a former NATO official reviewing declassified materials years later. "Not just what we were doing, but what we were thinking, what we were worried about, where our divisions were. That's more valuable than any satellite photograph." The ultimate impact extended beyond the specific intelligence gathered. The Romeo operation demonstrated, more effectively than perhaps any other Cold War intelligence program, that human intelligence could still compete with technical collection methods in the age of satellites and electronic surveillance. It showed that understanding psychology could be more powerful than understanding technology. For the intelligence community, the operation became a case study in the limits of security systems. You could vet people exhaustively, monitor their communications, and restrict their access to information. But you couldn't prevent them from falling in love. And once emotional attachment formed, rational security considerations often became secondary. The operation also revealed uncomfortable truths about gender dynamics in Cold War bureaucracies. The Romeos had succeeded partly because Western governments had created a class of women with significant access to sensitive information, but limited career prospects and social visibility. These women were trusted with secrets, but not with power, a combination that made them both valuable and vulnerable. The Stasi didn't create the loneliness and frustration that made these women vulnerable, observed a feminist historian analyzing the Romeo operations years later. Western societies created that. The Stasi just weaponized it. The final tally of the Romeo operation's success from the Stasi's perspective was mixed. They had achieved an intelligence windfall that any intelligence service would envy. They had penetrated some of the most sensitive institutions in the Western Alliance. They had maintained operational security for decades, with many operations never detected until the Stasi's files were opened. But they had also lost the Cold War. The German Democratic Republic had collapsed. The socialist system they had defended with such sophistication had proven economically and politically unsustainable. The secrets they had stolen hadn't prevented their defeat. And perhaps most poignantly, they had built their success on the systematic emotional destruction of people who had posed no threat to them beyond their access to information. The Romeos had won tactical victories while participating in a strategic defeat, leaving a trail of broken hearts and betrayed trust that outlasted the regime they had served. The peak moment of the Romeo operation wasn't a single dramatic incident, but rather the gradual accumulation of thousands of small betrayals, conversations over dinner, documents photographed late at night, love letters that were really intelligence reports. It was bureaucratized heartbreak, industrialized intimacy, systematized seduction. And in the end, both the agents and their targets were casualties of a conflict that demanded victory at any cost, even the cost of human dignity and genuine human connection. The Stasi's Romeo operation left scars that outlived both the Cold War and the German Democratic Republic itself. When the last documented case was finally closed in the mid-1990s, the operation had spanned nearly 4 decades, making it one of the longest-running and most psychologically sophisticated intelligence programs of the entire Cold War. The intelligence legacy was substantial, but ultimately overshadowed by strategic failure. The secrets stolen by Romeo agents filled thousands of pages in Stasi archives, but they couldn't prevent the economic stagnation, political sclerosis, and ultimate collapse of the East German state. As historian Timothy Garton Ash observed, the Stasi learned everything about the West except the one thing that mattered: why free societies, despite their dysfunction and disorder, proved more resilient than controlled ones. For Western intelligence services, the Romeo operation became required study in counterintelligence training. The operation demonstrated that sophisticated adversaries would exploit any vulnerability, including ones that seemed too personal or too emotionally intimate to be part of professional espionage. The lesson was uncomfortable. Complete security was impossible because human nature itself was a vulnerability that couldn't be eliminated. NATO and allied intelligence services implemented numerous reforms in the wake of Romeo exposures. Enhanced vetting procedures, psychological screening, mandatory reporting of relationship changes, and compartmentalization of sensitive information. Yet, intelligence officials privately acknowledged that determined adversaries could still exploit emotional vulnerabilities. The best they could do was raise the cost and difficulty of such operations. The personal legacy for the women who were targeted remained painful decades later. Some rebuilt their lives, though many struggled with the psychological trauma of discovering that significant periods of their lives had been based on calculated deception. Support groups formed in the 1990s, allowing victims to share experiences and attempt collective healing. "We were casualties of war," one victim told a journalist years later. "But our wounds were invisible, and nobody wanted to acknowledge them." For the Romeo agents themselves, reunification brought an uncertain fate. Some faced prosecution, though legal proceedings were complicated by questions about whether espionage for a formerly recognized foreign government constituted a crime. Others simply disappeared into the general population of reunified Germany, their past known only to themselves, and the Stasi archivists still processing millions of documents. Markus Wolf lived until 2006. Dying at 83 as a complex figure, admired by some as the intelligence virtuoso, condemned by others as an architect of mass psychological manipulation. His memoirs, published in 1997, showed little remorse for the Romeo operations. "We were at war," he wrote, "not with guns, but with information. Our methods were effective. That is all that intelligence services can ultimately claim." But perhaps the deepest legacy was what the Romeo operation revealed about the Cold War itself. Here was a conflict ostensibly about ideology: capitalism versus communism, freedom versus tyranny, democracy versus totalitarianism. Yet one of its most effective intelligence operations was built entirely on manipulating the most universal and apolitical of human emotions: the desire to be loved. The secretaries who provided NATO secrets weren't motivated by communist ideology. They weren't opposed to Western democracy. They simply wanted connection, companionship, and affection in a society that often left them isolated and invisible. The Stasi understood this and exploited it with clinical precision. In that sense, the Romeo operation was both completely cynical and utterly human. A reminder that beneath the grand ideological struggle, the Cold War was ultimately about individual choices made by individual people, often for reasons that had nothing to do with politics at all. The files in the Stasi archive at Normannenstrasse still contain those photographs. Aging couples who weren't really couples, relationships that weren't really relationships, love that was never really love. They're museum pieces now, artifacts of a conflict that ended with the fall of a wall and the collapse of an empire. But they're also reminders of a darker truth: that in the Cold War, as in all wars, the most devastating weapons were sometimes the most intimate ones. The Romeos didn't need nuclear missiles or armored divisions. They just needed patience, training, and a sophisticated understanding of human loneliness. They won their battles and lost their war. But the people they used as weapons, the secretaries who typed the secrets, the agents who lived the lies, lost something that couldn't be quantified in intelligence assessments or measured in pages of classified documents. They lost years of their lives to a deception so complete that even now, decades later, some still struggle to understand what was real and what was performance, what was genuine and what was simply excellent tradecraft. That may be the Romeo operation's ultimate legacy. Not the secrets stolen or the operations compromised, but the demonstration that in the Cold War's shadow conflict, the most powerful weapons weren't always the most obvious ones. Sometimes they were simply people trained to make you believe in something that was never there at all.